Before I begin, I also want to thank a few people, especially thank James O'Brien, who organized this event. He invited me to participate, and he got the funding for this event. He wrote a lot of grants and just did a tremendous amount of work. So let's give James a quick hand. And I also want to thank the Chautauqua County Historical Society for keeping the Tourgee papers accessible over all of these years. Without their support and their assistance, I certainly could have never written my book on Albion Tourgee. And finally, I want to thank the Robert H. Jackson Center for letting us use this beautiful facility today for this event. Since the Jackson Center is the host of the event, I thought that I would begin my talk with a letter from Robert H. Jackson. On April the 4th, 1950, the Supreme Court Justice wrote a letter to some of his friends in Jamestown, New York. Jackson had recently discovered an impressively argued legal brief by one Albion W. Tourgee, filed among the papers in the 1896 U.S. Supreme Court case of Plessy v. Ferguson. Jackson knew it had to be the same Albion Tourgee he recalled hearing about in his youth, though he'd never met him. This was a once famous author who lived in nearby Mayville. He knew this because Tourgee's career had been built upon the forceful advocacy of black civil rights and the vigorous defense of the racial egalitarian ideals of Reconstruction, two characteristics of the brief he had discovered. But more than this, Jackson knew it because could there really be two men named Albion Tourgee? And in all my studies, I can say I only found one other Albion Tourgee. It was Albion Tourgee Woods, who's in fact named after Albion Tourgee. Now, Jackson was mystified as to how this upstate New Yorker came to be involved in a case arising out of New Orleans. And he wondered why Tourgee's participation and his powerful arguments in the case were not as well known to locals as Tourgee's best-selling novels. Curious about how Tourgee got into the case, Jackson marveled at his far-sighted arguments. Quote, "There's no argument made today that he would not make to the court," Jackson observed, adding, "His brief is a rather witty production of points." In particular, Jackson took notice of Tourgee's assertion that, quote, "the law ought to at least be colorblind." And he remarked, "Whether this was original wit with him, it has been gotten off a number of times since as original wit." Jackson's investigation into the Plessy case came not out of idle curiosity. On the very date of Jackson's letter, April the 4th, 1850, two cases were argued before the Supreme Court that once again challenged the constitutionality of racial segregation. These were the cases of Sweat versus Painter and McLaurin versus Oklahoma Board of Regents. Each involved segregated schools. Each offered the court with an opportunity to reverse the infamous precedent of Plessy v. Ferguson that had established the famous separate but equal doctrine that was used by the state of Louisiana to justify legally required racial segregation. That was the legal foundation of the Jim Crow South, and it was built upon the Plessy decision. As Jackson wrote to his friends, he pondered whether or not he would vote to reverse Plessy, and remarked that it still remained to be seen whether Tourgee's position would be adopted and, quote, "what was a defeat for him in 96 will be a post-mortem victory." Tourgee's post-mortem victory would have to wait 4 more years. In 1950, Jackson and a majority of his colleagues on the Supreme Court chose not to directly attack the precedent of Plessy v. Ferguson, but rather to vote in favor of the plaintiffs in the two above-mentioned cases on narrower grounds. Instead, it would be Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka in 1954 that dealt the death blow to Plessy. In that landmark case, a unanimous court that included a physically ailing Justice Jackson and a brand new Chief Justice, Earl Warren, ruled that segregating schools by race is, quote, inherently unequal, unquote, and declared, quote, "any language in Plessy v. Ferguson contrary to this finding is rejected." Though its legal standing is no more, the Plessy case should not and cannot be erased from history. Over a half-century since the momentous Brown decision, the same debate over the proper remedies for racial injustice and protections of equal citizenship that Tourgee helped to initiate in the 19th century remain unsettled. There is much to learn from revisiting Tourgee's early struggles for civil rights, and it is true, just as Justice Jackson remarked in 1950, there are a few arguments made today that Tourgee did not make himself back in 1896. Indeed, Tourgee's brief in the Plessy case has recently been rediscovered by a new generation of legal and historical scholars, and its arguments have become the subject of rapidly increasing attention in law reviews and scholarly journals over the past decade. His arguments that the law should be colorblind, for one, has drawn attention from scholars who recognize his use of this concept as one of the first influential articulations of a constitutional position on race-neutral citizenship. At the same time, Tourgee made pioneering arguments about the nature of white privilege, in particular his assertion that whiteness functions as a kind of property in America that inherently advantages some while disadvantaging others. The assertion that whiteness is property has been more recently a main contention of legal scholars who reject the possibility of race-neutral citizenship in a society with deeply entrenched institutional and cultural racism. In his elaboration on these points and others, Tourgee may still have more to contribute to our contemporary debates on the relation of race and citizenship. But today, I want to begin with a more simple question before maybe returning to those themes. Who was Albion Tourgee? It's also still true today what Jackson said back in 1950, that people don't know Tourgee or about Tourgee or his involvement in the case or his work beyond his novels. His list of distinctions is long, and in fact, the case of Plessy v. Ferguson came at the end of a remarkable career